The city lights of Chicago stretched endlessly below the glass walls of Alexander Sterling's penthouse office. Rain tapped lightly against the floor-to-ceiling windows, a soft rhythm that barely reached the sharp edges of his thoughts. At 42, Alexander was used to control over deals, over people, over every inch of his world. Power was his language, charm his tool, and yet, tonight, he felt a restless pause he hadn't allowed himself in years. He leaned back in his chair, listening to the distant hum of traffic below, the subtle whisper of the wind against the building. Every interaction, every smile, every promise he'd made he measured, calculated, perfected. People admired him, feared him, wanted him, but he had long stopped feeling anything real. And that certainty, that quiet emptiness, was about to meet a spark he hadn't anticipated. Somewhere in the lobby, a new presence was arriving, a young intern, fresh, unpolished, entirely unaware of the currents she was stepping into. She wouldn't notice the usual games, the subtle manipulations that had bent so many before her, and yet, without knowing it, she would shift everything he thought he controlled, tonight. Alexander Sterling would learn that not every challenge could be met with power or seduction. Some required something far more fragile and far more dangerous. And as the elevator doors opened, the first glimpse of her would change the rules entirely. The rain had started early that morning, a steady drizzle that glossed the streets of downtown Chicago like silver threads. From his penthouse office, Alexander Sterling could see the city awaken below him, cars slicing through puddles, streetlights reflecting off wet pavement, the distant murmur of early commuters moving toward the river. The wind pressed faintly against the floor-to-ceiling windows, carrying the scent of rain and asphalt, sharp and clean. He watched it all without moving, his fingers drumming lightly on the edge of his mahogany desk. At 42, Alexander had mastered control. Every gesture, every word, every glance he offered had purpose. He knew the power of presence, of subtle pressure. Most people didn't notice the way he leaned, or the calculated softness in his voice when it served his aim. They only saw success, the tailored suits, the gleaming shoes, the penthouse that floated above the river like a fortress. But what they didn't see was the quiet behind the walls, the calculation, the solitude, the way he measured people, gauging weakness and ambition, seeing the world as a series of transactions. Emotions were tools or obstacles. Sentiment was a luxury he had long since abandoned. He stood and moved toward the window, hands clasped behind his back. The office was quiet except for the faint hum of the HVAC system and the occasional drip of water from the sky. He let his gaze linger on the river below, noting how the currents split, merged, and vanished under the bridges. Alexander liked patterns, liked predictability, liked knowing exactly how things would unfold if he pulled the right strings. A soft knock pulled him from the view. "Come in," he called, not turning. The door opened. A young assistant stepped in, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She carried a tablet, a notepad, and the calm air of someone who had rehearsed every step before entering. "Morning, sir. Your calendar for today," she said, holding the devices out with precise hands. Alexander barely glanced at her. The routine was familiar, comforting even. Calendars, appointments, reminders, everything a map of his control. Still, he acknowledged her presence with a curt nod. "Thank you, Sarah. Anything urgent?" "Nothing unexpected. All your calls are scheduled. The board meeting prep is complete. Mr. Lanning from marketing will join you at 10:15. Her voice was steady, but he noted the slight lift of her brow, the hint of careful attention. Most people entering this office felt dwarfed, awed by the height of the room, the city view, the implied power. They stumbled, rushed, tried too hard. She didn't. That alone earned a quiet flicker of his attention. He returned to his desk and sat, leather creaking under him. Papers were arranged just so, contracts on the left, strategy reports on the right. A pen lay between his fingers, poised, waiting. Alexander liked the silence, the ritual of preparation. He let himself take a deep breath, slow, deliberate, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease fractionally. Yet, beneath the calm, a familiar edge stirred. The city outside was alive with ambition, with people trying to climb, to take, to impress. He had seen it all before, colleagues trying to charm, competitors trying to manipulate, friends or lovers trying to entangle him. For decades, he had used charm like a weapon, a carefully calibrated smile, a quiet question that revealed more than it disclosed, and it always worked. Until recently, the predictability of human behavior had reassured him. His phone buzzed softly, a text from Lanning, confirming a minor change in the agenda. Alexander didn't react immediately. Instead, he allowed himself a small indulgence, a moment to watch the water-slicked streets below, noting reflections of neon signs stretched across puddles. For all his control, for all his power, he had begun to feel a faint, almost imperceptible restlessness. The same restlessness he felt that first morning he entered this office as a young executive. Back then, he had promised himself he would never be vulnerable, never exposed, never distracted. A knock again, firmer this time. "Yes," he said, voice measured, controlled. The door opened wider. "Mr. Sterling, the new intern has arrived, Madison Clarke," Sarah announced, then stepped back. Alexander's gaze lifted. Madison Clarke. The name meant nothing yet, but the way Sarah said it carried a weight of expectation. Alexander didn't care much for interns. They were temporary, eager, pliable, ideal for gathering data, running errands, absorbing corporate lessons. Rarely did they have substance, vision, or the nerve to challenge him, and rarely did he notice them at all. The elevator ding echoed faintly from the hall, and a moment later, she stepped into the office. Alexander observed from behind his desk as she moved, careful but unforced, not rushing to impress, not shrinking under the implied dominance of the space. Her posture was natural, her steps deliberate. She carried a notebook and pen, ready to take in the world rather than impress it. Alexander felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, a curiosity he had not allowed himself in years. He leaned back in his chair, observing silently as she introduced herself, her voice calm, steady, polite. She didn't flinch when he asked the first question. She didn't preen when he offered the obligatory welcome. She simply answered, direct, precise, unflinching, the kind of answer that demanded attention not by charm, but by clarity. For a man used to measuring others, used to bending their responses to his will, this was different, disarming, not threatening, but different enough to unsettle him in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. Alexander returned to the window, pretending to review the city below, but his mind lingered on the young intern. He noted the subtle confidence in her posture, the intelligence in her brief, precise answers, the quiet strength that didn't beg for approval. It was an anomaly in his world, a variable he hadn't anticipated. And for the first time in many years, he felt a hint of uncertainty, not panic, not fear, but a quiet, unnerving awareness that control, no matter how complete, could be challenged not by power nor by charm, but simply by someone who refused to play the game he had perfected. A soft laugh from the hallway broke the silence. Alexander looked toward the door, catching the faint reflection of Madison's notebook as she adjusted her pen. That small, unremarkable movement, the tilt of her wrist. The way her eyes scanned the page carried a weight far heavier than any handshake or polished smile. He leaned back, allowing himself a small, almost imperceptible sigh. Something about this day felt different. And though he didn't yet know it, everything in his carefully ordered world was about to change. The elevator doors chimed softly as they slid open, releasing a fresh scent of polished metal and faint perfume into the penthouse hallway. Alexander Sterling didn't move immediately. He remained at his desk, letting the light from the overcast sky catch the sharp angles of his office, the edges of his desk, the glass walls that framed the city below. The hum of the city was quieter up here, distant and muffled, as if the world existed in two separate realities, his and theirs. Footsteps approached, slow, confident, the kind of rhythm that didn't need validation. Alexander's eyes lifted, tracking the movement in the reflection of his desk glass before he even looked directly. Madison Clarke. She entered the office with her notebook held loosely, pen tucked between her fingers, posture straight, but not rigid. Her expression was calm, attentive, but not timid, not the least bit awed by the penthouse, by the floor-to-ceiling windows, or the sprawling view of the Chicago River. Alexander noted every detail, the tilt of her head, the way her gaze lingered on the city briefly, then returned to the folder she carried. She didn't offer a rehearsed smile. She didn't play the part of the eager intern desperately seeking approval. She simply nodded, small and precise, and said, "Good morning, Mr. Sterling. I'm Madison Clarke." Her voice was soft but certain, confident without pretense. He leaned back in his chair, letting the corner of his mouth twitch just enough to betray the flicker of curiosity. Most people stepped into his office and felt a tide of deference sweep over them, bending them before the view, the furniture, the implied authority. Not her. She moved like someone aware of herself, aware of her purpose, but unconcerned with hierarchy. And for a man accustomed to influence, control, and the predictable sway of charm, it was disarming. "Good morning, Miss Clarke," he said finally, voice even, measured. "Welcome to Sterling Industries." He gestured toward the empty seat across from his desk. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She simply took it, placing her notebook carefully on the polished surface, pen at the ready. The silence stretched for a moment. The kind of quiet that isn't empty, it hums. It observes. It measures. Alexander found himself watching her hands as they adjusted the notebook, the faint tension in her fingers, the subtle shift of weight from one foot to another. Nothing flamboyant, nothing performative. Small, human movements that somehow made the air between them feel charged. "So," he said, leaning forward slightly, "your orientation schedule has been set. You'll shadow several departments today. Lanning from marketing will guide you through the current campaigns." He paused, studying her. She met his gaze steadily, without flinching, without pleading for acknowledgement. "I've read the materials you sent ahead," she said calmly, flipping open her notebook. "I'd like to start with the marketing strategy. If that's acceptable, no hesitation, no flattery, no hint that she considered this request bold or inappropriate. Just a statement, simple, clear." Alexander leaned back again, impressed despite himself. Interns usually arrived like blank pages, timid and cautious, waiting for guidance, waiting for permission. They often flattered, tried to charm, or at least tried not to appear incompetent. Madison Clarke wasn't any of those. She had a voice, she had presence, and more importantly, she didn't seem to recognize the weight of the office around her. He allowed a faint smile, almost imperceptible, and said, "Direct, efficient. I like that." There was a subtle shift in the room. Alexander felt it more than saw it, a change in rhythm, a subtle spark in his focus. He usually prided himself on controlling the tempo of interactions, guiding conversations, eliciting responses that fit his plan. This time, the pace was set elsewhere, by her, without effort, without intention. And for the first time that morning, he realized he was reacting, not planning, reacting. The assistant, Sarah, cleared her throat quietly and left, leaving them alone. Alexander leaned back in his chair again, eyes narrowing slightly as he watched her make a few notes. She didn't scribble hurriedly. She didn't rush. She wrote with intent, absorbing the space, taking in the view briefly, then jotting something down that made her nod to herself, small and almost imperceptible. He felt a strange mix of emotions, curiosity, certainly, intrigue, yes, and beneath it, a flicker of anticipation he hadn't allowed himself in years, the kind of anticipation that didn't come from deals, numbers, or acquisitions. It came from presence, from someone who refused to be impressed, manipulated, or swayed by the usual trappings, For a moment, Alexander remembered why he had built walls around himself in the first place. Power, control, charm, these were shields, not indulgences. And yet, here was someone unguarded in her approach, capable of entering his world without fear, without strategy, without pretense, someone who could, unknowingly, bypass the defenses he had spent decades constructing. He cleared his throat lightly and leaned forward. "Tell me, Miss Clarke, what drew you to this internship, to Sterling Industries?" She looked up from her notebook, meeting his gaze directly. "I wanted to learn from the best," she said simply, without flattery, "and to see how a successful company connects with people, beyond the numbers and charts." Her tone was calm, unassuming, but the words carried weight. She wasn't there to impress him. She was there to understand, to observe, to grow. Alexander felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in years, a faint admiration, mingled with the subtle pull of curiosity. Most people wanted him. Most people wanted leverage, a title, a step forward. She wanted understanding, not control, not advantage, just understanding. He leaned back, letting the chair creak softly, the hum of the HVAC filling the gap. "Interesting," he said quietly. "Most interns don't ask that question. They focus on advancement, on appearances." She shrugged slightly, almost casually. "I've never been interested in appearances." The statement lingered in the air, simple, unadorned, but it struck a note. Alexander found himself studying her, noticing the small, confident tilt of her chin, the steadiness in her eyes. She carried herself differently, and it unsettled him not in fear, but in a way that made him alert, focused, and intrigued. The office phone rang softly, breaking the tension, but he didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, he watched Madison as she glanced at her notes, then at the city below, the rain casting thin lines across the glass. He noted the subtle shift of her shoulders, the calm in her movements, the quiet assertion in every gesture. And in that quiet observation, a thought crossed his mind, a rare, uninvited one. Perhaps the world didn't always need to be manipulated, charmed, or controlled. Perhaps there was another way. Not yet, not fully, but a possibility, faint and compelling, that this young intern, with nothing but her clarity and honesty, might just challenge the way he saw everything. He leaned back again, letting the moment stretch, the hum of the city, the faint patter of rain, the subtle movement of Madison writing a note, all of it combined into a quiet, electric tension. For the first time in years, Alexander Sterling felt uncertain, not powerless, not vulnerable, but unsure. And the certainty of that uncertainty was unsettling. Madison looked up, her gaze meeting his for a brief second, and in that glance, he felt a shift. Something small, unspoken, but undeniable. The rules of the game he had mastered for decades were no longer entirely his to set. And just like that, the office felt different. The rain outside continued its soft rhythm, but inside, everything had changed, in ways he couldn't yet name. The morning sunlight seeped softly through the penthouse windows, glinting off the chrome accents of the office and warming the polished wood beneath Alexander Sterling's fingers. He sat back, watching Madison Clarke as she carefully organized her notes, the subtle tilt of her head as she followed the presentation slides on the screen. There was no hurry in her movements, no overeagerness, just focus, attention, intent. Alexander observed quietly, noting the small details others often overlooked, the way she paused before jotting something down, the way she asked a question not to impress, but to understand. Unlike the interns who had come before her, those who flattered and shuffled nervously, Madison carried herself with a kind of quiet clarity. She didn't seek his approval, and she didn't seem to recognize him as a stepping stone to fame or advancement. Her first question was simple, clear, precise. How do you measure client engagement beyond numbers? Is there a qualitative metric that reflects loyalty rather than just repeat purchases? She didn't stumble over words. She didn't hesitate. She didn't bat her eyelashes or soften her tone, just asked. Alexander felt the flicker again, the one he had felt yesterday, the one that made him pause, watch, and measure differently. She wasn't playing a game. She wasn't testing him, nor attempting to charm. She wasn't another target to conquer. And in that honesty, he found himself leaning slightly forward in his chair, interested, not intrigued in the superficial way of desire, but curious. He said nothing immediately. Instead, he watched as she listened intently to the response from Lanning, the marketing director. Madison nodded subtly, scribbling a note that made sense only to her, then lifted her gaze at exactly the right moment to ask a follow-up. It was thoughtful, deliberate. It showed comprehension without pretense, a depth rare in someone her age, rare in anyone who stepped into this office. Alexander's chest tightened imperceptibly. He had spent decades mastering the subtle art of persuasion, of charm, of reading ambition and bending it to his favor. He was accustomed to being the one who shifted the balance, the one who observed, guided, and, when necessary, manipulated. But Madison, she wasn't shifting, she wasn't yielding, and that in itself was unsettling. He caught himself studying the way her pen moved across the notebook, the way she tilted her wrist as she wrote, pausing occasionally to glance at the slides, then back at him. Nothing about her movements was artificial. Nothing was performed. She was simply present. And in that presence, Alexander felt the first, faint pull of something he hadn't allowed himself to consider in years: respect. The session continued. She asked questions that others would never think of, questions that teased out the core of strategy, rather than the surface polish. Alexander found himself noting her logic, impressed despite himself. He caught a glance from Lanning, whose brow had lifted slightly. Usually, Lanning fielded these questions with practiced patience, brushing off anything overly detailed. Today, he responded fully, and Madison listened without interruption, then nodded with understanding rather than agreement. Alexander's eyes lingered longer than necessary. He felt the old patterns stir patterns of interest, assessment, calculation, but now mixed with something softer, something unfamiliar. He realized he wasn't calculating leverage, or influence, or charm. He was watching someone navigate the office with integrity, someone who didn't treat him as a prize, or a means to advancement. She treated the work itself as meaningful, and him merely as context. A pause came naturally, a quiet moment as Madison flipped a page in her notebook. She looked up at him, eyes steady, voice calm. "Mr. Sterling, if we consider the last campaign, do you think the messaging resonated authentically, or did it focus too much on incentives rather than connection?" It was the right question, not flattering, not indirect, not designed to make him feel important, just direct, honest. Alexander felt a slight tightness in his chest again, a mixture of surprise and admiration. He leaned back, letting his fingers tap the arm of his chair as he considered how to answer. Most interns wouldn't even notice that, he said slowly, more to himself than to her. Madison merely nodded, jotting the comment down without reaction. No smile, no show of pride, no flattery. She simply continued taking notes, her focus on comprehension and accuracy. Alexander realized, almost reluctantly, that this was the first time in years he had interacted with someone who didn't view him as a challenge, a goal, or a target. Madison didn't seek advantage, didn't test boundaries, and didn't try to impress. She listened, she engaged, and she responded with substance. The session ended, but Alexander lingered in thought. He found himself remembering the interns he had mentored, or thought he had mentored over the years. They were eager, ambitious, hungry, but they were predictable, easily influenced. Madison was different. Her curiosity wasn't performative. Her intelligence wasn't wielded as a tool. It simply existed, quietly and persistently. He allowed himself a slow, deliberate exhale, leaning back in his chair, watching her pack up her notebook with care. Her movements were precise, controlled, yet completely natural. Alexander realized that he was unconsciously measuring every gesture, every glance, every subtle shift, not to manipulate, not to charm, not to impress, simply to understand. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, barely noticeable, not for admiration, not for seduction, not for strategy, but for the rare, unspoken quality she brought into the room, authenticity. He hadn't felt it in years, perhaps not ever. The hum of the city below filled the quiet moments between them. Alexander noticed the rain had stopped. The streets reflected a faint glow from the morning sun, the reflections stretching and breaking across the wet asphalt like fractured light. And he realized, with a rare clarity, that this intern, this 25-year-old with quiet confidence and integrity, had already changed something in him. He didn't yet know how far it would go. He didn't yet know the implications for the office, for his routines, for his calculated interactions. But he felt it, the unmistakable shift, the subtle disruption, the sense that the rules he had long relied upon were now just slightly uncertain. As Madison glanced up once more, catching his eyes briefly, Alexander found himself holding her gaze, not in command, not in challenge, simply observing. There was an unspoken acknowledgement he was watching her, and she didn't need him to watch. The moment stretched, a pause in the rhythm of the day, quiet, deliberate. And then Madison offered a small, polite smile before gathering her things and heading toward the door. Her steps were measured, not rushed, leaving the space with ease, yet leaving a trace of presence he could still feel. Alexander leaned back, hand on the arm of his chair, chest rising slowly. He let the moment linger, the hum of the city and the quiet of the penthouse settling around him. The first impression, simple as it was, had planted a seed he couldn't ignore. Something different had entered his world, something honest, persistent, and unassuming. And in that quiet, calculated office, Alexander Sterling realized that this would not be like any day before. Something had changed, something subtle, but unmistakable, and he didn't yet know just how much it would grow. The morning light had shifted slightly, brushing the penthouse office with a softer glow. Alexander Sterling leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on Madison Clarke as she organized her notes and prepared to leave for her first assignment. The rhythm of the office had shifted subtly. Her presence created a quiet tension, an undercurrent that made the usual patterns feel incomplete. "Madison," he said, voice low but steady. "I want you to start working with the senior marketing team. They'll brief you on the current campaigns and integrate you into their projects. Observe, participate, and bring me a summary at the end of the week." He watched her reaction carefully, noting the slight lift of her brow, the almost imperceptible nod that acknowledged the task without hesitation or awe. "Yes, sir," she said, calm, precise, carrying neither deference nor the faintest trace of flattery. Her focus was on the work itself, and it unsettled him in a way he didn't expect. Most interns would have blinked, fumbled, or tried to charm their way into favor. Madison simply moved with quiet purpose. Alexander followed her with his gaze as she left, the soft click of her heels against the marble floor echoing faintly in the expansive hallway. He felt a pull of curiosity, a tension that had nothing to do with ambition or charm. He realized he wanted to see how she would navigate the senior team, how she would handle herself among people accustomed to deference, people used to being the smartest in the room. The marketing floor was a whirl of activity. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, and the hum of brainstorming sessions filled the air. Madison stepped in without pause, notebook open, pen at the ready. She greeted the team with a polite nod, her voice soft but clear as she introduced herself. No pretense, no theatrics, just presence. Alexander observed from a distance, standing behind a glass partition. He noted the way the team reacted, initially dismissive, expecting another inexperienced intern. But Madison's composure, her focused questions, Her subtle engagement with the data caught their attention. She didn't demand respect. She earned it quietly, simply by being competent, attentive, and thoughtful. She started with a review of last quarter's campaigns, scanning performance metrics and customer feedback. Her pen moved deliberately across her notebook, jotting notes that were more than a transcription. They were observations, insights. Occasionally, she would tilt her head and ask a pointed question. Have we considered how customers perceive the tone of this message? Is it genuine, or does it feel manufactured? The room paused. The question was simple, yet sharp. Alexander felt the faintest smile tug at the corner of his lips. Not because of pride, or because she asked about him, but because she was unafraid, unfazed by hierarchy. She wasn't asking to please him or anyone else. She was asking to understand, to see the truth in the work, and that clarity, the lack of pretense, was magnetic. One of the senior marketers, a man used to being the center of attention, responded defensively, offering a rehearsed justification. Madison listened carefully, pen poised, then tilted her head and asked another simple, precise question. If we shift the messaging slightly to focus on customer stories rather than incentives, do we risk diluting the campaign's effectiveness, or could we increase engagement by building authentic connections? The room fell silent. It was a subtle challenge, but delivered without aggression or judgment. Alexander noticed it immediately. The team had to pause, to consider her perspective, to weigh her words. She didn't dominate, she guided, and it worked. Alexander felt a shift inside himself. Something he hadn't allowed in years, a sense of respect, mingled with curiosity, and a faint spark of something softer, something unfamiliar. He realized he was holding his breath slightly, waiting to see how she would navigate the responses, how she would handle subtle resistance without losing composure. She nodded when she received an answer, jotting notes carefully, acknowledging the feedback, then rephrasing the discussion with clarity. Alexander felt a rare pang of admiration. She had a presence that commanded attention without effort. She had intelligence that didn't seek recognition, and most importantly, she seemed unaffected by the usual politics that ran through every office at Sterling Industries. By the end of the morning, Madison had quietly mapped the campaign's strengths and weaknesses, highlighting opportunities for a more authentic approach without criticizing the team. She presented her initial observations with clarity, asking strategic questions that were both insightful and respectful. The senior team was impressed quietly, internally. Alexander noticed it, of course. He noted every subtle glance, every pause, every shift in posture. She was effective without being forceful. She was influencing without controlling. Alexander let himself smile again, this time a little more openly. Not for pride, not for charm, simply for recognition and acknowledgement that someone could enter his carefully managed world and make an impression purely through clarity, focus, and honesty. A short pause came as Madison gathered her notes, preparing to leave the marketing floor. She glanced briefly at Alexander's office across the hall, as if aware that someone was observing, and then continued down the corridor. Alexander's eyes followed her, noting the natural rhythm in her stride, the subtle confidence that didn't need validation, the quiet assurance that she was capable of handling what most would stumble through. He leaned against the glass partition, letting the hum of the office and the soft buzz of activity fill the space. He felt a subtle tension loosen, replaced by curiosity. This intern, this young woman with quiet confidence and integrity, had already begun to alter the usual flow of his office, the predictable hierarchy he had maintained for years. Alexander allowed himself a small, rare thought, perhaps competence, authenticity, and clarity could be more disruptive than charm, influence, or control. And as the day continued, he realized that Madison Clarke would not simply observe. She would participate. She would challenge. She would provoke thought in ways that were subtle but profound. And he found himself waiting not to intervene, not to direct, but to see how she would navigate, how she would influence, how she would shape the world around her without even trying. A soft laugh drifted from the corridor, and Alexander noticed the reflection of sunlight on Madison's notebook as she adjusted a pen. That small, unremarkable gesture carried weight, a quiet signal that she was not like any intern he had encountered. Alexander exhaled slowly, letting the hum of the city below fill the moment. The first task was underway. The first impression had been made, and already he felt that the rules of his carefully ordered office were shifting, just slightly, in ways he didn't yet understand. Everything was about to change. The conference room smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood, the morning sunlight filtering through the tall windows and landing in rectangles across the sleek table. Madison Clarke sat quietly at the end, notebook open, pen poised, eyes calm but attentive. Around her, the senior marketing team shuffled papers, tapped on laptops, and murmured over campaign projections. The air carried the usual mix of ambition and tension, but Madison seemed almost untouched by it, focused on the work itself rather than the performance. Alexander Sterling watched from the glass partition outside. He could see the subtle movements, the tilt of her head as she absorbed a slide, the careful way she scribbled notes, the way her eyes flicked up just long enough to gauge reactions before returning to the page. There was a rhythm to her focus, deliberate and precise, that drew him in without her even looking at him. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was steady, clear, carrying across the room without raising its volume. "I've been thinking about the next campaign," she began, her gaze scanning each team member without lingering too long. "I believe we can increase engagement and brand loyalty not by pushing incentives or appealing to fleeting emotions, but by telling authentic stories, real experiences from our customers, shared honestly, stories that connect instead of manipulate." A quiet pause fell over the room. Laptops stopped typing. Phones were set aside. The senior marketers exchanged glances, a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Alexander felt a subtle tug of anticipation in his chest. She wasn't offering a gimmick or a shortcut. She was challenging the entire foundation of their traditional approach. One of the directors, a seasoned strategist with a sharp tone, leaned forward. "You mean, abandon the proven tactics, the campaigns we know drive immediate sales?" Madison shook her head gently, eyes steady. "Not abandon entirely. Shift the emphasis. People can sense when they are being manipulated, but they respond to honesty, to narrative, to connection. If we prioritize authenticity, we build loyalty that lasts, not just short-term gains." Alexander's attention sharpened. Her words weren't reckless or naive. They were precise, measured, thoughtful. He felt the familiar thrill of evaluation, but this time mingled with something unexpected: respect. Her ideas had potential, and more importantly, she presented them without ego or performance. She didn't need praise. She needed clarity. Madison continued, flipping a page in her notebook and pointing to a diagram she had sketched. "We can integrate customer stories across social platforms, newsletters, and events. Each piece highlights real experiences, challenges, and successes. It's subtle, but it builds credibility, and credibility converts better than hype in the long term." The room murmured, a mix of questions, doubts, and tentative agreement. Alexander's gaze lingered on her calm composure. She wasn't apologetic. She wasn't defensive. She was steady, guiding the conversation with quiet authority. The team was adjusting, shifting, responding to her clarity rather than resistance. He noticed the slight tightening of her jaw as she anticipated questions, the way her hands rested lightly on the table, ready to respond without intrusion. Every gesture was purposeful, every word deliberate. Alexander felt a faint, unfamiliar sensation, a spark of anticipation, not from charm, not from desire, but from witnessing competence, integrity, and vision embodied in someone so young, so understated. A senior team member raised another point, probing for feasibility. "What about metrics? How do we measure engagement if we're not pushing promotions?" Madison met the question with a thoughtful nod. "We can track qualitative metrics: customer sentiment, repeat interactions, referrals. Combine that with quantitative data. Yes, but let the story drive trust first. Trust will create sustained engagement beyond the numbers. Alexander's fingers drummed lightly on the glass of the partition. The strategy was risky, certainly unconventional, but it carried elegance. It respected the customer, it respected the brand, and it respected her voice, her ability to communicate effectively without coercion. The discussion stretched over the morning, with Madison answering questions calmly, guiding the team, responding with clarity. Occasionally, she leaned slightly forward to emphasize a point. Small movements, simple gestures, yet they carried influence. Alexander found himself holding his breath at moments, watching her navigate the subtle dynamics of the room. She didn't dominate, she didn't perform, she simply led, quietly, firmly, authentically. By the time the meeting was nearing its end, the initial skepticism had softened into cautious intrigue. Alexander saw nods, subtle shifts in posture, small smiles of reluctant acknowledgement. Madison had earned it, not by pushing or preaching, but by presenting ideas with conviction and clarity. Alexander allowed himself a slow exhale, a slight lean against the partition. He felt the familiar edge of control, the instinct to step in, to guide, to correct, but he restrained it. She didn't need intervention. She was navigating this herself, and the results were quietly, undeniably effective. Madison closed her notebook, standing with a grace that was effortless. She glanced around the room, offering a small, polite smile. I look forward to seeing how this develops. I'll summarize the discussion and provide a draft strategy for your review. Her voice carried calm assurance, not arrogance. The team began to gather their papers, murmuring their approvals and tentative questions. Alexander observed her from the glass partition again. She had shifted the room subtly, yet profoundly. Without effort, without ego, without overt display, she had challenged convention and earned attention. For Alexander, the effect was deeper than professional intrigue. He felt a rare flicker curiosity, respect, anticipation, and a quiet awareness that the rules of his office, of influence and authority, were being nudged in ways he had not anticipated. He realized that Madison Clarke was not merely an intern. She was a catalyst, a challenge, and perhaps, in time, something more. The hum of the city below reminded him of its constant rhythm, but the office felt different, charged with a tension he didn't expect. Madison had entered the room quietly, almost invisibly, and left an impression that would linger. He allowed himself one last, long look before turning back to his desk, fingers resting lightly on the papers in front of him. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. Something had changed. Something had been set in motion. And Alexander Sterling knew, without yet understanding how or why, that the coming days would be unlike any he had orchestrated before. Madison stepped out of the conference room, notebook under her arm, and Alexander's gaze followed her. Her presence, so calm, so assured, had quietly unsettled him. The office air seemed heavier, charged, expectant. He leaned back in his chair, letting the moment linger. The hum of keyboards, the soft clatter of chairs, the faint murmur of conversation. It all blended into a backdrop for a single thought that echoed louder than any strategy. She was different. She had arrived, and for the first time, Alexander felt the faint, thrilling uncertainty of something he could not control entirely. The office was quiet now, the buzz of the marketing floor fading into soft murmurs behind the glass walls. Alexander Sterling sat at his desk, hands folded over the edge, eyes tracing the patterns of sunlight glinting across the polished surface. Madison Clarke had returned from the conference room, notebook under her arm, her stride calm, her posture confident. She didn't rush, she didn't hesitate. She simply existed in the space with clarity and presence that made the usual hum of activity feel uneven in the most intriguing way. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, letting the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. He had spent years assessing people quickly, decisively, calculating ambition, resilience, and strategy in the blink of an eye. But Madison was different, not because she was bold or clever, but because she was authentic. She didn't manipulate. She didn't seek advantage. She engaged with honesty, with precision, with integrity, and he found himself studying her longer than he would have allowed himself in the past. Alexander pushed his chair slightly away from the desk, standing and pacing to the windows. The river below was calm, the morning sun painting gold and silver across its surface. He thought about the morning's discussions, the questions she asked, the observations she made, the subtle but undeniable impact she had on the senior marketing team. He felt something that had been rare for years, genuine respect. He turned back to her, seated now at her desk, just outside his office. Her fingers moved deliberately over her pen, jotting notes, pausing to think, then writing again. Every movement was purposeful, every glance calculated with care. Alexander felt a faint thrill not from charm, not from allure, but from recognition. She was capable, thoughtful, and precise. She had the ability to take the pieces he allowed her to see and create something cohesive, something meaningful. He called her in. The soft click of her heels on the marble floor sounded distinct in the quiet office. She entered without fanfare, notebook held at her side, eyes calm but alert. Alexander gestured to the chair across from him. She sat, posture straight, hands resting lightly on her lap, as if she were ready to absorb whatever he would offer, but without expectation. "I've been reviewing your notes from the morning session," he began, voice deliberate. "Your observations, your questions. They reflect a clarity I don't often see in someone at your stage. Most interns focus on surface metrics, presentations, pleasing senior staff. You focus on substance, on impact, on authenticity. That approach, it's rare and valuable." Madison nodded, eyes steady, listening without reacting with surprise or flattery. Her calm acknowledgement only reinforced what he already suspected: she was not performing for him. She was simply present. "I'm going to grant you access to more data," Alexander continued, leaning back slightly. "Financial reports, campaign analytics, customer feedback, everything the senior team uses to make decisions. I want you to take this strategy of yours, expand it, refine it, and bring me a comprehensive draft. I trust you'll handle it responsibly." Madison blinked once, a small, polite movement, and inclined her head. "Understood. Mr. Sterling, thank you for the access. I'll make sure the insights are accurate and actionable." Her tone was soft, respectful, yet entirely self-assured. She wasn't seeking permission. She wasn't attempting to charm. She simply acknowledged responsibility. Alexander exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the decision settle. He felt an unusual warmth, not of sentimentality, but of satisfaction and appreciation for competence, for honesty, for someone who could navigate the office with integrity and skill. The city outside continued its hum, traffic moving in synchronized chaos. But inside the penthouse, time seemed to slow, giving him space to consider the rare talent in front of him. "You'll also have access to internal resources," he added, watching her absorb the words without haste. "Software tools, team reports, research data. Use what you need, but respect the boundaries of the company. This is not about shortcuts. This is about insight and execution." Madison's fingers flexed lightly around her pen. "I understand," she said. "I'll make sure every recommendation is based on evidence and analysis, not assumptions or trends." Alexander allowed himself a faint, approving nod. She was careful, deliberate, methodical. The kind of precision he had always valued, yet rarely encountered at such a young age. He thought about the morning meeting again, how she had shifted the room's attention, how her questions had guided rather than challenged overtly, how her presence had subtly altered the pace of discussion. He realized that in granting her access, he wasn't merely delegating a task, he was extending trust, a currency he rarely offered. Madison rose to leave, notebook under her arm. Alexander watched her walk back to her desk, her movements unhurried, her focus intact. He felt an unusual tug in his chest, a mixture of curiosity, respect, and anticipation. She was not just capable of completing the task, she was capable of challenging the very assumptions that had guided their campaigns for years, and he was eager to see how she would do it. The afternoon passed in a quiet rhythm. Madison worked meticulously, poring over reports, analyzing data, sketching preliminary ideas. Alexander observed from the office, allowing her space, letting the hum of her focus fill the quiet. Every now and then, he glanced at her, noting the steady movement of her pen, the calm assurance in her posture, the way her eyes flicked between spreadsheets and notes with effortless precision. By the time the sun shifted lower, casting long streaks of golden light across the penthouse, Alexander had made his decision. He would give her full support, access, and resources. She had proven, in a matter of hours, that her ideas were not only thoughtful, but actionable. She had earned his confidence, not through charm, not through flattery, but through clarity, honesty, and skill. He finally leaned back in his chair, hands folded across his chest, letting a slow, deliberate breath fill the office. Madison had arrived quietly, without fuss or drama, and had already begun to shape the course of the day. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Alexander knew it. Her influence, guided by intelligence and integrity, would ripple across the company. As Madison gathered her notes and prepared to leave for the day, Alexander watched her pause at the glass partition. She looked briefly at him, a small, polite smile tugging at her lips. It was faint, almost imperceptible, yet it carried a weight of acknowledgement. He nodded subtly in return. The message was clear. She understood the responsibility he had entrusted, and she would rise to the challenge. The city outside continued its steady hum, the lights of skyscrapers beginning to glint against the approaching evening. Alexander sat back, eyes on the horizon, fingers drumming lightly against the polished surface of his desk. He allowed the quiet moment to stretch, letting the sense of anticipation, respect, and possibility fill the office. Madison Clarke had begun her first project, and Alexander Sterling, for the first time in years, felt a thrill not of control, but of genuine curiosity. Something was unfolding, something significant, and he didn't yet know how far it would go. The office felt heavier that morning. The hum of computers, once steady and soothing, now carried a subtle tension. Madison Clarke moved between desks with her notebook in hand, eyes calm, yet alert. She could feel it, the shift in energy, the quiet glances, the faint murmurs that followed her down the rows of workstations. The campaign she had begun to shape, the strategy Alexander had entrusted her with, was facing its first internal storm. She stopped at the marketing team's area, scanning spreadsheets, reviewing feedback, jotting observations. Her movements were deliberate, calm, but Alexander could sense the subtle undercurrent of resistance emanating from elsewhere. The sales department, particularly, had grown wary. Their meetings had begun to feel different, small size when she spoke, eyes rolling, murmured comments that barely masked disdain. She could hear fragments of conversation. Is she really working for him, or is this personal? The words stung, not because they were loud, but because they implied her presence was transactional, not earned. Alexander noticed it immediately when he walked past her desk later that morning. His eyes swept across the office, catching the way her colleagues avoided her gaze, whispering behind screens, exchanging looks that spoke of suspicion and gossip. She glanced up from her notes, locking eyes with him briefly, and he saw a flicker of unease but not fear. Not yet. Just awareness. A quiet recognition that she would have to navigate more than strategy now. By midday, the subtle tension became more pronounced. Laura Mitchell, the company's sharp-eyed counsel, appeared in the marketing area, clipboard in hand, expression unreadable. Madison straightened instinctively, pen still poised over her notebook. Laura's reputation preceded her, unyielding, precise, and notorious for challenging new ideas, particularly those that threatened the status quo. "Miss Clarke," Laura said, her tone neutral but edged with scrutiny. I understand you've proposed a change in our marketing approach. Care to walk me through the rationale? She didn't smile. She didn't soften her posture. She didn't offer any preamble. It was the first test, and Madison could feel its weight, but she didn't flinch. Of course, Madison replied calmly, voice steady, eyes meeting Laura's without hesitation. She explained the concept of authentic storytelling, the emphasis on real customer experiences, the long-term benefits of trust and engagement. She spoke slowly, deliberately, ensuring every word carried clarity and confidence, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Laura's eyes narrowed slightly, lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, Madison wondered if she had miscalculated. But then Laura leaned forward, tapping her pen against the clipboard, and asked pointed questions, questions that tested the logic, the feasibility, the risks. Madison responded with precision, citing data, examples, and potential solutions. Each answer was deliberate, measured, and unflinching. Alexander watched from his office, fingers steepled under his chin. He could feel the tension radiating from the glass walls. The office, usually a place of routine efficiency, had transformed into a battlefield of subtle power dynamics. Yet Madison navigated it without posture or pretense. She commanded respect, not through authority, but through competence. As the afternoon progressed, whispers began to spread. Employees speculated about her relationship with Alexander. "Do you think she's—" Someone murmured. "I heard Sterling himself." Another nodded subtly. The rumor was thin, barely audible, but it traveled faster than any memo. Madison felt it brush past her like a cold wind. She paused at her desk, notebook in hand, letting her pen hover over the page. The air felt heavier, judgmental, intrusive, but she didn't respond with anger or defensiveness. She simply continued her work, letting focus replace confrontation. Alexander noticed her slight pause from across the office. He recognized the quiet moment of reckoning, the point at which a person either falters under scrutiny or rises through it. Madison's hand moved again, pen dancing lightly across the page, outlining her next steps, her thoughts coherent and deliberate. She had chosen clarity over reaction, substance over performance. Later, Laura returned with her review notes, voice still precise, still measured. "Your ideas are intriguing," she said, her tone unyielding, but with a hint of acknowledgement beneath. "Implementation will require oversight. You'll need access to additional data and coordination with multiple departments." Madison inclined her head. Acknowledging both the challenge and the approval implicit in the assignment, Alexander observed this exchange quietly. Her ability to face resistance without faltering, to remain composed and focused while rumors swirled around her, impressed him more than any technical skill could. He realized that granting her resources and access wasn't just about executing a marketing strategy. It was about trusting her judgment, her resilience, her integrity. By late afternoon, Madison had begun to integrate the additional data, mapping out how her authentic marketing strategy could be rolled out department by department. She paused occasionally, glancing around the office at the faint glances cast her way. She felt the weight of observation, of judgment, but she also felt a growing resolve. This was part of the process. Resistance was natural. Misunderstanding was expected. The challenge was not to react with emotion, but to navigate with purpose. Alexander leaned back in his chair, watching her from the office above. He noticed the subtle strength in her movements, the calm precision of her decisions, the quiet authority she wielded without arrogance. He allowed himself a faint, approving smile. She was learning not just to implement strategy, but to influence subtly, navigate corporate friction, and maintain integrity under scrutiny. The day drew to a close, the sun casting long, soft shadows across the office floor. Madison gathered her notes, organizing her observations, reflecting briefly on the challenges she had faced. She felt a flicker of fatigue, but not defeat. The internal opposition had tested her. The rumors had brushed against her confidence, yet she remained poised, unbroken, and focused. Alexander caught the small, almost imperceptible nod she gave as she looked toward his office once more. He understood. She had not only survived the scrutiny, she had asserted her competence and integrity, and he felt the faint thrill of anticipation, realizing this was just the beginning. The office settled into quiet as employees left for the evening, the hum of electronics slowing, the click of heels fading down the corridor. Madison paused at her desk, pen resting lightly on her notebook, eyes reflecting the soft glow of the city lights outside. The internal battles had tested her, and she had endured. Alexander leaned against the glass partition one last time, exhaling slowly. He let the hum of the city below and the quiet of the office fill the room. Madison Clarke had faced her first real challenge, unflinching, unwavering, and he knew, with quiet certainty, that this young intern, calm, focused, authentic, would continue to reshape not only the project, but the very dynamics of his carefully controlled world. The city lights reflected on the polished floors, faint streaks of gold and silver catching in the glass walls. Madison adjusted her pen, glanced toward Alexander one more time, and whispered softly under her breath, more to herself than anyone else, "We'll see how this unfolds." And Alexander, observing from above, felt the unmistakable weight of something new entering his office. Something that would not be contained, something that would challenge him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Something had begun. The boardroom was vast, the windows stretching from floor to ceiling, allowing the soft glow of late-morning sunlight to spill across the polished table. Madison Clarke stood at the head, notebook in hand, slides projected clearly on the screen behind her. Alexander Sterling sat near the back, observing quietly. The room hummed with anticipation, executives shifting in their chairs, murmuring softly to one another, occasionally tapping pens against the table. Madison opened her presentation, her voice steady, clear, and calm. "Good morning," she began, letting the words fill the space without hurry. "Today, I'll walk you through the findings from our recent campaigns and how we can strengthen customer loyalty while enhancing long-term value." She clicked to the first slide, displaying charts and customer feedback summaries. Her movements were deliberate, her posture upright but relaxed. She didn't flinch at the weight of the room, the scrutiny of the board, or the skeptical eyes that followed her every gesture. Alexander watched as the executives exchanged quiet glances. Some leaned forward, intrigued. Others folded their arms, doubt etched in the lines of their faces. Madison ignored the whispers. She scanned the room, then continued. "The data shows that campaigns emphasizing authentic storytelling, highlighting real customer experiences, have higher engagement rates and produce more sustained loyalty compared to campaigns focused solely on incentives or promotions." A few eyebrows lifted. One board member, a man known for his insistence on quick returns, leaned back, a skeptical frown forming. "Sustained loyalty is fine, Miss Clarke," he said, "but how long until this strategy actually produces measurable revenue? How do we know the delay won't hurt our bottom line?" Madison nodded slightly, acknowledging the concern without reacting defensively. "We've analyzed engagement over 6 months across multiple demographics," she said softly, yet firmly. "The initial investment in authentic content may not yield immediate spikes in sales, but the long-term value of customers' repeat purchases, referrals, advocacy rises steadily. Over the year, projections indicate an increase in lifetime customer value by 15 to 20%. The room was quiet for a moment. Alexander noticed some of the executives exchanging looks, trying to reconcile what they'd been taught short-term metrics. Quick wins with this slower, more deliberate approach. Madison continued, her voice measured, calm, inviting. "We've also mapped feedback trends. Customers respond to transparency. They notice inconsistency, hype, and manipulation. By centering our campaigns on authentic stories, we align with their expectations and foster trust. Trust translates into loyalty, and loyalty translates into consistent revenue streams." A senior executive leaned forward sharply, voice slightly clipped. "And the cost of this time, resources, personnel." Madison met the question with steady eyes. The approach requires careful allocation of existing resources, with minor adjustments to content production and messaging. No additional headcount is necessary. The key is strategy and precision, not volume. Alexander felt a subtle shift in the room's energy. The usual arrogance of senior executives, the automatic skepticism, had softened slightly. Madison's calm confidence, her deliberate pace, and her clarity were breaking through the walls of doubt. She didn't argue. She didn't challenge with force. She led through reason and evidence. Another board member, a woman with years of experience in finance, raised a hand. And what about external perception? Our competitors won't be waiting. Won't they copy the approach if it proves successful? Madison smiled faintly, just enough to acknowledge the concern. Authenticity cannot be copied. Each customer story is unique, genuine, and rooted in real experiences with our brand. Attempts to mimic will feel artificial and fail to resonate. This is why our strategy emphasizes genuine engagement over generic messaging. Alexander exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly. Her composure, insight, and subtle strength were commanding attention without a single raised voice. The boardroom, a place usually dominated by authority and assertiveness, had become a stage for her quiet leadership. Madison clicked through more slides, showing examples of customer interactions, engagement graphs, and feedback patterns. Her notes were precise, her narrative clear. She connected each point to measurable outcomes, translating authenticity into quantifiable results. Alexander noticed the slight tension easing in some of the skeptical faces. They were still cautious, still uncertain, but curiosity had replaced immediate doubt. The discussion continued, punctuated by soft questions, deliberate answers, and careful observation. Alexander watched her respond to challenges with patience, each reply measured and factual. There was no defensiveness, no flattery, no attempt to win over the room with charm, just clarity, just substance. A pause fell. Madison took a breath, letting the room absorb the information, the graphs, the examples. Then she said softly, "Ultimately, this strategy is about alignment, aligning our message with the expectations and experiences of our customers. It requires patience, yes, but the payoff is sustained trust, long-term engagement, and brand credibility that cannot be bought or forced." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with thought. Alexander observed the subtle movements, the folding of hands, the slight nods, the slow exhalations. She had not only presented data, she had reframed the discussion, shifted perspectives, and forced even the most skeptical members to consider a different approach. Finally, one of the executives leaned back, voice measured. "It's unconventional. I can't say it's what I expected, but there's logic here. And the projections, they're compelling." Another nodded in agreement, albeit slowly. Madison's calm presence and precision had begun to turn doubt into cautious consideration. Alexander's gaze lingered on her, noting the small, quiet confidence in her stance, the way she held her notebook lightly, her eyes attentive but not pleading, her tone measured. She had not sought to impress. She had not sought to charm. She had simply been herself, deliberate, competent, authentic. The meeting ended, but the impression lingered. Madison gathered her materials, glancing briefly at Alexander, a subtle acknowledgement of shared understanding. He inclined his head slightly, silent approval, recognition, and the faintest hint of anticipation for what was to come. As she stepped out of the boardroom, the sunlight falling softly through the glass, Alexander felt the quiet thrill of something rare, not just competence, not just insight, but a presence, subtle and steady. That could challenge norms, influence perception, and shift dynamics without aggression. The city outside shimmered with afternoon light. In the boardroom, quiet murmurs followed her steps. Reflection, consideration. Alexander Sterling, observing from the back, allowed himself a slow exhale. The strategy had been presented. The first impressions had been made. The wheels of change were turning, and somewhere in the quiet space between her calm exit and the thoughtful faces left behind, Alexander knew that the next steps, the deeper challenges, the implementation, the real test of influence were only just beginning. The boardroom was quieter than usual that afternoon. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting rectangles of gold across the polished table. Alexander Sterling stood at the head, hands resting lightly on the surface, eyes scanning the faces of the executives. Their expressions were cautious, wary, some tinged with skepticism, others with curiosity. Madison Clarke sat nearby, notebook open, pen poised, her presence calm yet steady. Alexander drew a slow breath, letting the faint hum of the city outside settle in his chest. He had watched the board's reaction to Madison's presentation earlier, the hesitation, the subtle doubt, the measuring of risks against potential reward. He understood their instinct corporate caution, entrenched practices, short-term metrics, but he also understood the value she brought, the insight, the clarity, the long-term vision, and he would make sure they understood it too. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice steady, resonant, "I want to share some additional data with you, data from our competitors, from comparable markets, from campaigns that mirror what Madison has proposed. These figures demonstrate that long-term engagement and authentic storytelling are not just theoretical. They produce measurable, sustained growth." He clicked the first slide, charts, numbers, comparisons. The executives leaned forward. Alexander's eyes flicked briefly to Madison, noting her calm composure. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't trying to influence the room herself. She simply observed, attentive, ready to support. The data spoke clearly. Competitors who had prioritized authentic messaging saw consistent increases in customer retention, higher referral rates, and improved brand perception. Alexander walked them through each example, slow, deliberate, letting the numbers settle, allowing space for the implications to sink in. A senior executive shifted in his seat, eyebrows knitting together. "But these are anecdotal examples," he said, voice cautious. "How do we know they're applicable to our brand, our market?" Alexander nodded, anticipating the question. "We've adjusted the models to reflect our customer demographics, our purchasing behaviors, and our brand touchpoints. The projections show a potential increase in customer lifetime value by nearly 20% over 12 months. These are not assumptions, they're informed projections based on observable trends." Madison shifted slightly, pen poised. Alexander caught her subtle nod, the tiny signal of acknowledgement, the quiet support she offered without speaking. He continued, now pacing lightly at the head of the table. "This is why I believe in Madison's strategy. It is thoughtful, it is informed, and it addresses both short-term operations and long-term growth. It is not speculative, it is strategic." A hush fell across the room. The executives were listening now, not just politely, but with attention. Alexander's voice remained calm, measured, confident, not commanding, but guiding. The room responded to reason, to evidence, to the clarity of insight. Madison had provided the foundation. He was merely presenting the reinforcement. Finally, one of the skeptical board members, a woman known for her conservative approach to investments, leaned back slowly. Her eyes softened slightly. A hint of acknowledgement. If the projections hold, this strategy could indeed strengthen our customer base sustainably, and the data supports it. Alexander allowed himself a faint nod, a subtle exhale. He glanced at Madison, who returned his gaze with the quietest of smiles. No words were exchanged, but the mutual understanding passed between them. She had planted the seeds. He had nurtured them into comprehension. And now the board was ready to see the value. Another executive cleared his throat, voice measured, and the timeline. "This approach requires patience. Yes, we're looking at long-term results rather than immediate spikes." Madison responded calmly, eyes steady. "Yes. The initial phase focuses on integrating authentic customer stories across multiple channels. We monitor engagement weekly, adjusting content and messaging based on feedback. Short-term returns may be moderate, But the strategy builds credibility and sustained loyalty that traditional campaigns often fail to achieve. Alexander felt the subtle shift. Heads nodded, pens scribbled notes, skepticism softening into consideration. The strategy was no longer just an idea, it had become a plan, anchored by data and reinforced by clear reasoning. He took a small step back, letting silence fall for a moment. The executives absorbed the information, the charts, the projections, no interruptions, no objections, just quiet assessment. He knew from years of experience that this was the turning point, the moment when doubt either hardened or gave way. Madison's foundation of authenticity, combined with his reinforcement, had pushed the room toward clarity. A senior director finally spoke, voice slower, more measured than before. "I can see the value. It challenges our traditional methods, yes, but the evidence and structure are compelling. I support moving forward with implementation, under careful observation." Another nodded, adjusting their papers. "Agreed, we'll proceed with the pilot, monitor results, and expand gradually if the outcomes match projections." Alexander exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain. He looked toward Madison, who was seated calmly, pen still resting over her notebook. She hadn't sought credit, hadn't demanded approval, but the board's acknowledgement reflected the weight of her insight. She had earned it not with force, but with clarity, reason, and integrity. The final murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Alexander allowed himself a subtle smile, satisfied not just with the board's decision, but with Madison's poise, composure, and quiet effectiveness. The strategy would move forward. The project would not only be maintained, it would expand. He leaned slightly toward her, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Well done," he said softly. Madison glanced up, eyes meeting his, faint acknowledgement in her expression, calm and measured. As the boardroom began to clear, Alexander remained standing for a moment, hands resting lightly on the table, watching the subtle reactions of the executives. The tension had shifted, resistance had softened, respect, at least cautiously, had been established. Madison gathered her notebook, preparing to leave the room. Her movements were deliberate, calm, precise. Alexander noted the quiet confidence in her stride, the way she carried herself even after facing scrutiny, the subtle poise that had turned doubt into acceptance. He followed her with his eyes as she stepped toward the door, then glanced back at the board. They were still processing, still considering, still adjusting to the idea that a young intern's strategy, one rooted in authenticity rather than manipulation, could drive meaningful business results. Alexander leaned back slightly, letting the quiet of the room fill him. The sunlight shifted, glinting off the polished surfaces, casting subtle reflections that danced across the table. The boardroom had witnessed the challenge, the evidence, the quiet authority of insight, and the outcome had shifted. Madison paused briefly at the door, glancing back, subtle acknowledgement in her eyes. Alexander's gaze met hers. He allowed the pause to linger, savoring the quiet affirmation, the recognition that trust had been earned, that the first true test had been met. And as the door closed softly behind her, he realized that this was only the beginning. The project was approved, but the real work, implementation, execution, and continued challenges was yet to come. The boardroom settled into quiet once more, but the energy lingered, a faint resonance of change. Alexander Sterling exhaled, slow and deliberate, the weight of anticipation settling alongside a rare, subtle satisfaction. Madison Clarke had not only presented a strategy, she had reshaped the conversation, and he knew, deep in the quiet rhythm of the office, that the path forward would be profoundly different from anything he had planned. Something significant had begun. The late afternoon sun poured through the penthouse windows, casting long streaks of gold across the polished floors. Madison Clarke sat at her desk, notebook open, pen poised, eyes scanning the latest feedback from the marketing team. Alexander Sterling moved quietly behind her, reviewing reports on the adjacent workstation. Their proximity was calm, measured, professional, but Alexander could feel the subtle tension, the quiet awareness of an unspoken connection threading between them. He glanced at her occasionally, noting the small gestures, the tilt of her head, the way she tapped her pen against the notebook before writing, the brief, intentional pauses as she considered data. She didn't look at him for validation, yet he couldn't help but notice. Something about the way she approached her work, with clarity and precision, drew him in without effort. He adjusted his posture, leaning slightly back, reminding himself that this was business, that lines needed to remain distinct. Madison, aware of his presence but not distracted by it, continued outlining strategies, integrating feedback, and adjusting projections. She had mastered the delicate balance of focus and awareness. Knowing he was observing without letting it influence her concentration, Alexander appreciated the subtlety. She maintained professionalism while being present in the same space, and he respected the boundary she upheld. The project required collaboration, discussions, adjustments, and moments of shared insight. Alexander occasionally spoke quietly to her, suggestions offered with precision, questions asked with clarity. She responded equally measured, thoughtful, never rushed, never overeager. Their voices, calm and steady, carried through the office in a quiet rhythm, punctuated by soft pauses, small sighs, and the occasional scratch of pen on paper. A minor disagreement arose over a data interpretation. Madison tilted her head slightly, eyes calm, and spoke clearly. "I see your point, but if we consider the engagement metrics alongside qualitative feedback, the outcome aligns differently. Perhaps we could test both approaches on a smaller segment first." Alexander observed her response, noting her tact, her patience, her ability to assert insight without challenging authority aggressively. He nodded, approving silently. The subtle tension between professional respect and personal awareness persisted. Both were acutely conscious of the unspoken energy between them, yet neither allowed it to interfere with workflow. Alexander realized he was learning something he had long ignored: how to operate alongside someone capable, inspiring, and quietly magnetic, without conflating respect with desire. It was a new rhythm, an exercise in patience and focus. By mid-afternoon, they moved to the larger data room to review customer engagement trends. The space was quiet, monitors displaying metrics, charts, and projections. Madison spoke softly, clearly, walking him through her insights, highlighting subtle patterns others might overlook. Alexander listened, absorbing, evaluating, occasionally offering a suggestion, never overstepping, never dominating. He marveled at her capacity to command attention through expertise rather than charisma. They paused briefly when a colleague entered with a minor update. Madison acknowledged them with a nod, Alexander with a subtle smile. Their interaction was professional, respectful, attentive, both aware of maintaining composure and boundaries. Even as the day's proximity and shared focus deepened their connection, back at her desk, they reviewed the integration of customer stories into the broader marketing plan. Alexander spoke, measured and deliberate. "I like how you've structured the campaign. It's thorough, yet adaptable." Madison responded with a faint smile, voice calm. "Thank you. I've aimed to make it flexible enough to adjust based on feedback while maintaining authenticity." The exchange was simple, precise, but carried weight. Each acknowledged the other's skill, insight, and presence without overstepping. As the day waned, Alexander noted the subtle signs of exhaustion beneath her composure, the brief pause before she wrote a note, the stretch of her shoulders, the soft exhale. He considered whether to comment, then decided against it. Respecting boundaries meant allowing her space to manage her own energy. Even as he silently monitored the rhythm of the project and the balance between focus and personal tension. Later, they gathered their findings for a brief review before the day ended. Madison laid out her conclusions succinctly, tying qualitative insights to measurable outcomes. Alexander listened carefully, occasionally interjecting with questions or clarifications. Each exchange brief, purposeful, professional. They worked side by side, close enough to feel the energy, aware of the subtle currents, but disciplined in maintaining decorum. The sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the penthouse. Madison gathered her materials, closing her notebook with deliberate care. Alexander stood, noting the rhythm of her movements, her calm assurance, the way she balanced focus and awareness effortlessly. He felt a quiet admiration, tempered by the discipline required to remain professional. "Excellent work today," he said softly, voice carrying just enough to reach her ears without drawing attention from any colleagues nearby. Madison glanced up briefly, a small, polite nod, acknowledging the compliment. No flirtation, no overemphasis, just recognition. Alexander allowed the pause to linger, appreciating the simplicity and gravity of the moment. They exited the data room together, walking side by side down the quiet corridor. Footsteps echoed softly. Alexander kept his tone neutral, offering observations about workflow adjustments, Madison responding with precise, thoughtful input. Their conversation was uninterrupted by personal commentary, yet the air between them was subtly charged a balance of respect, acknowledgement, and unspoken awareness. Alexander reflected on the lesson of the day: professionalism could coexist with intrigue. Collaboration could be efficient without sacrificing boundaries. And connection, however quiet, could be acknowledged without transgression. Madison had taught him, without words, how to navigate presence, competence, and subtle engagement simultaneously. They paused at the elevator, the hum of the building faint but constant. Alexander watched her hand hover over the button, small gestures deliberate. "Tomorrow, we'll review the first test results," he said. Voice measured, adjust as needed, maintain the focus you've established. Madison nodded, voice calm, understood. I'll have the analysis ready. The elevator doors slid open, reflecting their figures in the polished metal. Madison entered first, still poised, composed. Alexander followed, hands loosely at his sides, observing, respecting, allowing the professional rhythm to guide their interactions. As the doors closed, the faint hum of the city filled the moment. Alexander felt a rare, subtle warmth, anticipation mingled with respect, curiosity tempered by discipline. They had established a balanced collaboration without compromise, awareness without intrusion, connection without transgression. And in that quiet, suspended rhythm, Alexander Sterling realized that the boundaries they had maintained today were as meaningful as the strategy they were implementing. Trust, integrity, and focus had become their shared currency. Madison Clarke's presence was now woven into the fabric of the project, the office, and the day. And Alexander, observing, felt both challenged and inspired. The path forward was clear, yet unpredictable. Balance would be key. Respect and awareness would guide each step. As the elevator reached the lobby, they parted ways, her stride calm, deliberate, purposeful. Alexander lingered briefly at the top of the escalator, watching the reflections of the city light play across the glass. The day had tested their professional connection, their boundaries, their mutual understanding, and it had succeeded. Something quiet, yet profound, had been established, and tomorrow, as the work continued, they would navigate the next challenge together, yet carefully, professionally, deliberately. The penthouse was quiet that evening, the soft hum of the city below muted by the glass walls. Alexander Sterling sat back in his chair, hands resting lightly on the armrests, eyes on the fading sunlight as it reflected off the river. Madison Clarke remained across from him, notebook closed, pen set aside. The tension of the day's work had softened, leaving a rare space quiet, reflective, intimate. Alexander exhaled slowly, letting the warmth of the room settle. For decades, he had built walls around himself, around his decisions, his interactions, even his emotions. Business had been the safe ground, the controlled environment where influence and logic ruled. Feelings were unpredictable. Vulnerability was weakness. That lesson had been reinforced early, sharply, with loss too profound to ignore. He glanced at Madison, noting the subtle attentiveness in her posture, the calm steadiness in her gaze. She didn't press for personal details. She didn't probe. She simply listened, present, patient, and that made the words easier to form. "I should tell you something," he began, voice low, deliberate, "something I haven't shared with anyone in years." Madison inclined her head slightly. Quiet acknowledgement, giving him space to speak. "My parents died when I was 19. He said, the words were simple, factual, but carried the weight of decades. A car accident. It was sudden. Nothing prepared me for it. I had nothing, no guidance, no support, only the raw reality of loss." He paused, letting the silence fill the space between them, letting the memory breathe. Madison's expression was calm, empathetic, but unreadable. Alexander noticed her restraint, her decision not to offer pity or condolences that might distract. She simply sat, listening, allowing him to recount, to release. "I built my career after that," he continued, voice steady, but softer than usual. "Every decision calculated, every relationship weighed. I learned to value power over sentiment, efficiency over emotion. Feelings, they were dangerous, distractions, vulnerabilities. So I removed them from the equation. I built walls around my business, around my life, around myself." A faint sigh escaped him. He rarely let such words out, rarely allowed the vulnerability. But Madison's presence, the integrity, the quiet focus, the absence of pretense made it possible. He felt, for the first time in 20 years, that he could share not for leverage, not for sympathy, but for understanding. Madison's eyes met his briefly, a subtle nod, encouraging without intrusion. She did not speak immediately, allowing him to continue. "And yet," Alexander said softly, "here you are. You've entered my world, not to impress, not to manipulate, not to climb or leverage. You're simply present, honest, thoughtful, authentic. And for the first time in years, I find myself wanting to be evaluated differently, not for advantage, not for gain, but for respect, for ideas, for merit." Madison's gaze softened, not with sentimentality, but with recognition. No words were needed to convey acknowledgement. Her calm presence, her quiet attentiveness, spoke volumes. Alexander felt the shift deep within, a subtle loosening of the walls he had built, a rare glimpse of human connection without risk of compromise. He leaned back, letting his fingers rest lightly on the polished desk. The sunlight had faded further, casting long shadows across the room, painting gold and silver reflections across the glass. "I've spent my life avoiding emotion," he admitted quietly, almost to himself. "I thought it made me safer, more effective. But your approach, your clarity, your honesty, it challenges that. It reminds me that respect, trust, and integrity are worth more than control, influence, or perception." Madison finally spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Sterling, I don't need to know everything about your past to work with you effectively, but I can see why it shapes your approach. What I can do is engage with the work, the strategy, and the outcomes with honesty, with respect. That's what matters. Not leverage, not hierarchy, just insight and trust." Alexander felt a quiet warmth in those words, a rare affirmation. For decades, he had rarely allowed anyone to see beyond the armor, beyond the strategy, beyond the calculation. Madison had earned the space where he could simply exist, simply share, without fear. He exhaled, slow, deliberate, the tension of years easing slightly. "For 20 years, I've avoided connection, avoided assessment based on merit rather than leverage. You make me want to reconsider, to trust, to be open to evaluation not for gain, but for respect and insight." Madison smiled faintly, subtle, understated, acknowledging the weight of his words without embellishment. She didn't reach across, didn't offer comfort, didn't intrude. She simply listened, responded, and existed in the space with him, allowing the moment to settle. The hum of the city outside filled the quiet room. Alexander leaned back further, hands clasped lightly behind his head, eyes tracing the patterns of light fading across the penthouse floor. He realized something remarkable: trust could be extended without fear of exploitation. Respect could be given without calculation, and connection could exist without compromise. Madison had brought all of that into the office with quiet assurance. "I think," he said slowly, "that moving forward, I want to be judged differently, not on the transactions, the influence, or the outcome alone, but on how ideas are received, how they're executed, and the integrity behind them. You remind me that such evaluation is possible and valuable." Madison nodded, her voice soft, deliberate. "Then that's where we begin. With clarity, integrity, and focus. Everything else follows from that." Alexander allowed himself a small, rare smile. He had built an empire of precision, influence, and control. Yet for the first time in decades, he felt the subtle thrill of collaboration built on merit, respect, and insight free from manipulation or pretense. The penthouse fell quiet again, the city's distant hum filling the gaps. Alexander Sterling looked at Madison Clarke and saw more than an intern. He saw a catalyst for change not only in the project, not only in the office, but in the way he approached connection, trust, and evaluation. Something profound had begun, and for the first time in 20 years, he wanted it to unfold honestly, openly, without the armor he had relied on for so long. The sunlight waned, shadows stretching, and in that soft, quiet space, Alexander felt a rare sense of equilibrium. His past was not erased, but it had room to breathe beside possibility. Madison had entered his world, and in doing so, had begun to reshape it. A small nod passed between them, subtle, unspoken, yet laden with understanding. The next step, the next challenge, the continued work it would unfold, but now with trust and respect guiding the way. And in that quiet, suspended moment, Alexander realized something he had long denied himself. He was no longer alone in navigating the balance between strategy, integrity, and connection. Madison Clarke had changed the rules gently, quietly, irrevocably. The penthouse felt heavier that morning. Sunlight filtered in, but it seemed dimmer, fragmented by clouds rolling over the city skyline. Alexander Sterling leaned against the edge of his desk, eyes fixed on a report that sat open on his laptop. Madison Clarke was beside him, notebook open, pen hovering over the page, ready to record, ready to react. The energy between them was tense, charged, and uncertain, a sharp contrast to the calm clarity they had maintained in the past days. "Henry Davis," Alexander said quietly, voice low, deliberate, carrying just enough weight to be noticed. Madison looked up, attentive, eyebrows knitting slightly. "He's been leaking sensitive information to our competitors." Madison absorbed the words without immediate reaction. Her hand tightened slightly around her pen, but her posture remained upright, calm, deliberate. She had faced internal resistance before, subtle whispers, doubts, and skepticism, but betrayal, deliberate and concealed, was a different weight. It required precision, strategy, and discretion. Alexander moved slowly to the floor-to-ceiling windows. Gazing at the city below, his jaw was tight, hands resting lightly on the glass. "It's contained, for now," he continued, "but it's enough to compromise the integrity of the project if we don't act quickly. We need to assess the damage, secure our data, and ensure the strategy remains uncompromised." Madison's pen moved, notes appearing on the page as she spoke softly, deliberately. "We can implement additional access controls immediately. Restrict sensitive files to core personnel. Encrypt communications and monitor data movement. It will buy us time to identify the full scope of the leak." Alexander nodded, absorbing the plan, feeling a subtle relief in her calm, methodical approach. He had relied on instinct for years, navigating threats through power and leverage, but Madison's approach was different, precise, grounded, and strategic. It required trust, and he trusted her judgment. Together, they moved through the digital infrastructure of the campaign. Madison analyzed access logs while Alexander contacted the IT security team, guiding them toward restricted protocols, ensuring nothing was overlooked. Her focus was intense, yet composed. There was no panic, only deliberate, strategic action. Alexander felt a rare sense of partnership, shared responsibility, mutual respect, and coordinated purpose. The tension in the office was palpable. Whispers had begun to circulate, subtle questions about the breach, doubts about team loyalty. Madison remained composed, guiding the project, navigating the subtle currents of suspicion without letting them derail focus. Alexander observed her quiet authority with growing admiration. She was calm in crisis, deliberate in response, and capable of influencing the team without force or ego. Alexander paused by her side, reviewing her notes. "Good," he said softly. "Keep monitoring. We need to know exactly what's been shared and with whom. I want no surprises." Madison nodded, eyes steady, fingers moving across the page as she outlined a containment plan. Hours passed in a rhythm of quiet vigilance. Alexander and Madison moved between workstations, reviewing data, updating security protocols, and recalibrating the project timeline to account for the disruption. The betrayal by Henry Davis had introduced a fragile uncertainty into the campaign, but Madison's methodical approach kept it from spiraling. Alexander felt the familiar surge of tension, tempered by trust in her competence. By late afternoon, the initial scope of the leak became clearer. Certain sensitive campaign elements had been exposed, but Madison's containment measures limited further compromise. Alexander reviewed the secured communications, his mind calculating contingencies, while Madison summarized recommendations for adjustments in the project. "Do we need to confront him?" Madison asked, voice low, controlled. She wasn't seeking drama, only clarity. Alexander considered the question, weighing options carefully. "Not yet," he said. "We act strategically, not impulsively. Confrontation now could alert the competition. First, we contain, adjust, and secure the integrity of the project." Madison nodded again, pen moving swiftly, recording each step, noting timelines, contingencies, and potential risks. She had transformed the crisis into a structured plan, and Alexander felt a rare sense of relief. Her calm competence had turned what could have been chaos into manageable precision. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the penthouse, Alexander allowed himself a brief pause. He watched Madison, noting the subtle lines of focus on her face, the deliberate rhythm of her movements, the quiet authority in her posture. She had not wavered, not panicked, not faltered, and in that, he found a rare sense of admiration, tempered by the urgency of the task at hand. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, voice carrying a weight that only Madison seemed to register fully, "we implement the adjustments across the campaign, monitor feedback closely, and continue development. Nothing else changes except we stay vigilant." Madison acknowledged him, her calm nod confirming understanding and commitment. The office around them began to empty, the faint hum of computers and the distant murmur of departing employees filling the quiet spaces. Alexander exhaled slowly, letting the tension of the day drift, but remaining alert. The betrayal had been a shock, but Madison had mitigated its effects, transforming a potential disaster into a controlled challenge. He allowed himself a rare glance at her, the quiet intensity of her focus striking him anew. In that moment, he realized that the project's success now depended as much on her integrity and composure as on the data, strategy, or projections. She had become not just a participant, but a guardian of the campaign's vision. Madison looked up briefly, catching his gaze. No words were exchanged, only acknowledgement and understanding of shared responsibility, trust, and the delicate balance between vigilance and progress. Alexander felt the subtle weight of this connection, grounded in mutual competence and respect, free from pretense, yet carrying unspoken significance. By evening, the containment measures were in place, sensitive files secured, communications encrypted, access controlled. Alexander reviewed the final summary while Madison outlined next steps, her voice calm, deliberate, and precise. Together, they had navigated the internal threat, stabilizing the project while maintaining momentum. The city outside glittered with lights, reflections dancing on the penthouse windows. Alexander leaned back, hands folded, exhaling slowly. Madison had faced the internal danger with clarity, patience, and skill. Her calm authority had prevented panic and guided the team through a precarious moment. He allowed a faint, approving smile. The threat was not over, but it was controlled. The project was secure, the strategy intact, and the partnership between him and Madison strengthened through shared vigilance. And in the quiet of the penthouse, Alexander realized something subtle but profound: trust, competence, and integrity could overcome betrayal. And with Madison by his side, the campaign and perhaps more was ready to face whatever came next. The night settled over Chicago, the city lights glinting across the river. Alexander and Madison remained at their workstations, focused, alert, connected by purpose. The internal danger had passed, but the tension lingered, a reminder that vigilance and collaboration were inseparable. Something critical had shifted. They had survived the first true internal test, and the foundation for what came next was stronger than ever. The penthouse had taken on a quiet warmth in the late afternoon, sunlight soft against the polished floors. Madison Clarke leaned over a set of campaign analytics, pen moving deliberately across the page. Alexander Sterling stood nearby, reviewing projections, the faint hum of the city below reaching their ears. For the first time, the air between them carried more than professional energy. It carried a subtle tension, an awareness of something unspoken. Alexander paused, fingers resting lightly on the edge of his desk, watching her work. He had always been comfortable in control, in defining the boundaries of engagement and interaction. But now, there was a quiet pull, a recognition of a presence that challenged the usual rhythm of his office, his day, and, unexpectedly, his heart. Madison sensed it too, though she didn't look up immediately. She was conscious of the faint pause in the air, the way his presence lingered without intrusion. Her chest tightened slightly, awareness sharpening. She had always respected authority, but this was different, intense, deliberate, and charged with possibility. There was caution, yes, but beneath it, a curiosity that mirrored his own. "You're considering the next phase?" she asked softly, voice steady, yet layered with the hint of shared understanding. Alexander nodded, letting his eyes linger briefly on her before returning to the projections. "Yes. We need to adjust the approach slightly. The metrics indicate subtle trends we can optimize for engagement." She tilted her head, pen resting lightly over her notes. "I agree. A few adjustments here and there, but the foundation is solid." The simplicity of her affirmation struck him, not flattery, not charm, only clarity and mutual acknowledgement. He realized he felt a rare vulnerability, an awareness of emotions he had carefully suppressed for years. They moved through the campaign together, sharing insights, correcting data, discussing implementation. Their collaboration was seamless, yet each exchange carried an undercurrent they both noticed but did not name. It was subtle small gestures, brief eye contact, the near touch of hands as they reached for the same chart. Alexander felt the flicker of caution. He had always guarded his heart, yet Madison's presence was eroding the walls he had built. Madison, equally aware, managed her awareness with grace. She maintained focus, professionalism, and precision, yet there was a quiet acknowledgement of the tension. Her gaze would meet his briefly, soft and deliberate, before returning to her work, every word measured, every movement careful, balancing proximity with boundaries. She understood the stakes, not just the professional, but the personal, delicate, unspoken stakes. A minor disagreement arose about the prioritization of certain metrics. Alexander suggested one approach, Madison proposed another. Their voices were calm, measured, professional, yet beneath each word was a subtle energy respect, acknowledgement, and a growing awareness of mutual admiration. Neither sought dominance, only understanding. And in that moment, both recognized the challenge of maintaining professionalism while navigating unspoken feelings. As the afternoon stretched on, their discussions became quieter, more reflective. Alexander found himself noticing the softness in her expressions, the subtle determination in her movements, the way she balanced focus and presence. Madison, aware of his attention, did not shy away, but maintained composure, allowing the moment to linger without forcing it. Alexander took a step back, exhaling slowly. He had spent decades managing perception, influence, and control. Yet here, with Madison, he felt something he hadn't in years, a willingness to engage without calculation, to acknowledge a connection without overstepping. It was unfamiliar, and it made him acutely aware of the emotions simmering beneath the professional exterior. Madison glanced up, her gaze meeting his for a brief moment. In that instant, there was understanding, a recognition that both were navigating this new terrain carefully, deliberately, respecting boundaries while acknowledging an undeniable pull. She returned to her notes, but the brief acknowledgement had left a subtle warmth, a quiet electricity that neither ignored. They continued their work, side by side, balancing collaboration with awareness. Alexander found himself lingering on her insights, valuing her judgment not only for its intelligence but for the integrity it reflected. Madison's respect for boundaries and clarity of thought mirrored his own careful approach to trust, creating a delicate symmetry. The sun dipped lower, casting long, soft shadows across the room. Alexander closed a set of reports, fingers resting lightly on the edges. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we'll review the initial outcomes from the latest adjustments. Refine as needed." Madison nodded, her voice calm, precise. "Understood. We'll monitor, adjust, and maintain the balance." For a moment, they paused, standing side by side, aware of each other's presence. There was a subtle tension, fear, respect, curiosity, and an almost imperceptible spark of something deeper. Neither acted on it, neither spoke of it, yet both felt the fragile thrill of possibility, a quiet acknowledgement of emotions untested, of risks carefully weighed. Alexander exhaled slowly, letting the moment linger. He had always valued clarity, focus, and control, yet now, the risk of vulnerability, the awareness of admiration, and the stirring of emotions he could neither suppress nor fully name added a new layer to his world. Madison had become more than a collaborator. She was a mirror to a side of him he had long kept hidden. Madison. Pen set aside, allowed a faint smile, subtle and unspoken, a quiet acknowledgement of the shared awareness between them. It was not declaration, not overt, but enough. Alexander felt it, a gentle pull, a delicate reminder that connection could exist alongside professionalism, that respect and trust could coexist with burgeoning emotion. The office settled into quiet as the city's lights began to shimmer, reflecting on the windows and polished floors. Alexander leaned against his desk, watching Madison organize her materials, her movements deliberate and measured. He realized that their collaboration had evolved, the professional balance now intertwined with awareness of emotion, of risk, of subtle intimacy. "Good work today," he said softly, voice carrying the weight of acknowledgement and subtle warmth. Madison's eyes met his briefly, a small nod, no words needed. The acknowledgement was enough, respect, admiration, and something quietly tender flowed between them, restrained yet unmistakable. As the day ended, both returned to their offices, each carrying the awareness of what had begun. The risk was real, the emotions raw, yet contained. They had navigated the delicate line between professionalism and personal connection, acknowledging the stirrings of something new while maintaining their shared focus and commitment. And in that quiet, suspended space, Both realized that the path ahead would be shaped not only by strategy and skill, but by the delicate, careful navigation of hearts awakening amidst responsibility, respect, and unspoken longing. Something was shifting, something fragile, profound, and quietly thrilling had begun. 3 months had passed since Madison Clarke's authentic marketing strategy had been implemented. The penthouse office carried a different energy that morning, warmer, lighter, as sunlight glinted off the glass walls and polished surfaces. Alexander Sterling stood by the windows, reviewing the latest performance dashboards, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Madison was seated at her desk, eyes bright, pen in hand, reviewing the results of their latest customer engagement reports. The metrics were clear, customer loyalty had risen sharply. Repeat purchases and referrals had increased steadily. Brand sentiment across social media platforms reflected a resonance that no previous campaign had achieved. Competitors had begun noticing, and whispers of interest in Madison's methodology had already reached Alexander's office. Offers to acquire the strategy were arriving. Though Alexander and Madison had no intention of selling, this was their vision, and they intended to see it flourish on their own terms. Alexander glanced at Madison, noting the subtle confidence in her posture. She wasn't boastful, not even proud in the conventional sense. Her satisfaction was quiet, measured, grounded in the knowledge that the work had produced meaningful results. He felt a rare warmth admiration mingled with respect, tinged with a personal pride he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "Your adjustments last week made a difference," Alexander said softly, voice carrying across the quiet office. Madison looked up, eyes meeting his briefly before returning to the dashboard. "Yes," she replied calmly. "We optimize content distribution based on engagement patterns. The response has been stronger than predicted." Her words were simple, yet the weight of their success lingered in the air between them. Alexander stepped closer, reviewing a report she had highlighted. "It's remarkable," he murmured. 3 months, and the metrics confirm it. Loyalty, engagement, trust all rising, and revenue impact is measurable. You've proven something rare here." Madison allowed herself a faint smile, subtle but genuine. "We've aligned the brand with authenticity," she said softly. "Trust isn't built overnight, but when it resonates, it has lasting value." The penthouse was quiet except for the soft tapping of keys and the occasional hum of the city below. Alexander allowed himself to exhale slowly, letting the tension of past challenges, internal resistance, leaks, boardroom skepticism drift into the background. Madison had navigated every obstacle with composure and skill. Her insights had transformed uncertainty into tangible, sustainable results. A notification blinked on one of the monitors, indicating an inquiry from a competitor about licensing the strategy. Alexander read it carefully, eyes narrowing slightly, but then he looked at Madison. "They want our method," he said softly, almost to himself. Madison glanced at the message, expression calm. "And will maintain control," she replied. Her focus was unwavering, her clarity absolute. They had built this together, and it would remain theirs. Alexander felt a surge of something he rarely acknowledged: pride. Yes, but also relief. Integrity and results had coexisted. Profit and principle had walked together, hand in hand. He allowed himself a subtle, approving nod. Madison had not only executed a strategy, she had demonstrated that honesty and authenticity could thrive in a world accustomed to manipulation and shortcuts. They moved together through the reports, comparing projections against results, noting subtleties, highlighting successes. The conversation was calm, methodical, yet each exchange carried an undercurrent of shared triumph. No words of personal sentiment were exchanged, but the acknowledgement was there, unspoken, understood in the quiet confidence of their collaboration. Alexander paused near her desk, watching as she highlighted key engagement trends. "It's rare," he said, voice low, "to see impact this cleanly, to align strategy with ethics and still achieve measurable growth." Madison glanced up briefly, expression reflective. "Ethics and effectiveness aren't mutually exclusive," she said softly. They reinforce each other. The challenge is maintaining integrity without compromising results. Alexander allowed a faint smile to cross his face. For years, he had navigated business through influence, charm, and leverage. Yet, here was a young intern, quietly reshaping the landscape, proving that principle and profitability could coexist. He felt a subtle, deep respect, a recognition that she had altered more than the campaign. She had altered the lens through which he viewed leadership, strategy, and success. A soft ding from the computer signaled another inquiry from an outside firm. Alexander glanced at it, then back at Madison. "They want to replicate the approach," he murmured. Madison didn't react outwardly, only a calm, measured acknowledgement. "It validates our model," she said. "It also confirms that consistency and authenticity are valued. That's the core of sustainable engagement." The afternoon light shifted, casting longer shadows across the room. Alexander and Madison continued reviewing, adjusting, analyzing. Each metric, each trend, reinforced the quiet affirmation that their approach worked not through shortcuts, not through manipulation, but through genuine, deliberate engagement. Alexander finally allowed himself a breath of satisfaction, leaning back slightly against his desk. The city below continued its hum, but inside the penthouse, there was a rare stillness. Success had arrived, tangible and undeniable, yet it was grounded in the integrity of process, not flash or spectacle. Madison had led them here, and Alexander felt both gratitude and admiration, unspoken yet profound. They gathered the final reports, aligning insights for presentation to the board. Alexander spoke quietly, voice steady. "This will change how the board views strategy. Not just metrics, but methods. Integrity and growth can coexist. Madison has proven it." She nodded, quietly accepting acknowledgement without embellishment. As they stepped toward the elevators, sunlight fading to soft gold through the windows, Alexander glanced at Madison. There was something subtle in her posture, her calm confidence, that spoke of both professional mastery and personal composure. He realized that the project's success was as much about her character and integrity as it was about strategy. The elevator doors closed behind them, reflections of city lights dancing across the glass panels. Alexander allowed himself a quiet exhale. They had navigated challenges, internal resistance, and corporate skepticism. They had maintained professionalism while fostering trust. And they had achieved something rare, measurable success without compromising principle. Madison glanced at him briefly, subtle acknowledgement passing between them. No words were needed. Their success, their collaboration, and the quiet recognition of integrity intertwined in that moment. Alexander realized that this was more than a campaign victory. It was a testament to leadership, trust, and the alignment of values and results. The city below glimmered as the evening settled. Alexander Sterling and Madison Clarke had demonstrated something profound, that authenticity could drive results, that principle could coexist with profit, and that the right partnership grounded in trust, respect, and integrity could redefine success. And as the lights of Chicago twinkled across the river, Alexander allowed himself a rare, subtle smile. The campaign had succeeded. The model had proven resilient, and the path forward, illuminated by integrity and insight, stretched ahead full of potential, guided by purpose, and strengthened by partnership. Something extraordinary had been achieved, and yet they both knew this was only the beginning. The morning air in Chicago was crisp, carrying the faint scent of the river and the hum of the city beginning its day. Alexander Sterling stood at the edge of the penthouse balcony, eyes scanning the skyline, the towering buildings, the streets below bustling with early commuters. The city had always been his kingdom, his empire, the place where influence and power dictated the rhythm of life. Yet today, it felt different. Madison Clarke appeared beside him, coffee cup in hand, her presence calm, steady. She didn't speak immediately, allowing the space between them to exist without pressure. Alexander inhaled slowly, letting the breeze carry the faint tension and anticipation away. He had made a decision, one that no projection, boardroom discussion, or financial report could dictate. This was personal, deliberate, and irrevocable. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, voice low, almost lost in the morning air. Madison turned to him, eyes attentive, waiting, patient, about the project, the city, everything we've built. "It's important. Yes. But there's something more I need to consider. Something I've avoided for years." Madison didn't rush him. She simply observed, the faintest awareness in her gaze. Alexander took a step back from the railing, letting the view of the river stretch before him, calm and reflective. "I've spent my life accumulating control, influence, and authority," he continued, "every decision calculated, every interaction measured, and yet, none of that matters if I compromise what's rare and real. What's here?" His glance fell to her, eyes steady, deliberate, revealing more than words ever could. Madison's fingers tightened around her coffee cup, a quiet acknowledgement. She had sensed this moment approaching, the point where professional partnership would intersect with personal reality. The tension between risk and desire, between caution and trust, had always been present. And now, Alexander was speaking it aloud. "I can step back," he said softly. "Not abandon the work, not abandon responsibility, but step back from the trappings, the constant demands, the relentless pace, to protect us, to protect this connection." Madison's lips curved faintly, a subtle, understanding smile. "And the company?" she asked, voice calm yet curious. "It will continue," he replied, "with the team we've built, the systems in place, and your guidance. Integrity and strategy don't vanish because I choose to prioritize life over empire." For a moment, they stood in silence, letting the city hum below, letting the weight of the decision settle. Alexander felt a rare lightness in that stillness, a sense of possibility he hadn't allowed himself in decades. Madison's presence beside him, steady, assured, and quietly affectionate, anchored him in a way power never had. "Are you certain?" she asked softly, voice measured, not probing, only clarifying. He nodded, eyes distant for a moment, reflecting on years of ambition, control, and careful calculation. "Yes, I've built enough, achieved enough, but I haven't lived enough, not in ways that matter most." Madison set her cup down, taking a small step closer. "Then let's do it," she said simply. "Together." The simplicity of her words, the quiet certainty, struck him more than any affirmation or approval from a boardroom ever could. He felt a surge of gratitude, relief, and something deeper, a rare, unguarded warmth. The day passed in deliberate motion. They gathered belongings, finalized a few essential documents for the company, and prepared for departure. Alexander's staff moved with a subtle awareness, sensing the shift, yet respecting the quiet dignity with which the decision had been made. Madison remained composed throughout, guiding the process with precision and calm, ensuring the transition was smooth without allowing emotion to overshadow professionalism. As evening approached, they stepped onto the private terrace, the city lights beginning to twinkle across the river. Alexander turned to Madison, voice low, reflective. "Chicago has been home, my arena, but it's time for a new chapter, one where we define success differently." Madison nodded, eyes reflecting the shimmering city lights, one where life, connection, and purpose coexist with work and achievement. They walked together to the waiting car, the hum of the city fading behind them. Each step felt deliberate, symbolic, a move away from old patterns, toward balance, toward something real and lasting. Alexander glanced at Madison, noting the quiet confidence, the strength in her gaze, and the subtle warmth that had grown between them over months of collaboration, challenges, and shared victories. The drive out of the city was calm, unhurried, the skyline gradually receding. Madison watched the river reflect the city lights. Alexander beside her in thoughtful silence, Neither spoke for a while, letting the quiet rhythm of the car, the hum of the engine, and the fading cityscape mark the transition. Alexander finally exhaled, a slow, deliberate release of years of tension. "I've spent my life calculating risk," he said softly, voice almost to himself. This is the greatest risk I've taken." Madison's hand brushed lightly against his, a subtle gesture, measured, respectful, "But perhaps the only one worth taking," she replied. The night stretched around them, calm and expansive. As they approached their new home, a quiet coastal retreat far from the city's relentless pace, Alexander felt a rare clarity. Power and control had been part of him for decades, but love, trust, and shared purpose were now redefining the parameters of his life. They stepped out, inhaling the fresh salt air, the sound of waves rolling gently along the shore. Madison smiled faintly, looking toward the horizon. "This feels like balance," she said. Alexander nodded, voice soft but resolute. Balance and freedom. And together, inside, the space was simple, welcoming, yet reflective of the life they intended to build. Work that mattered, engagement that was authentic, and the freedom to nurture connection without compromise. Alexander felt the weight of years lifting, replaced by something he had long denied himself: the quiet certainty of choosing love, partnership, and life over empire alone. They stood together, side by side, watching the moon rise over the water, the city left behind, the hum of ambition replaced by the rhythm of waves, wind, and shared presence. In that quiet, suspended moment, Alexander Sterling realized that the greatest success was not in dominance, control, or wealth, but in choosing connection, integrity, and love. And as they began their new life together, a life balanced between purpose and joy, work and love, Alexander knew that the choice he had made to step back, to prioritize the human over the empire, was not a surrender, but a profound triumph. Something rare, enduring, and beautiful had begun. 2 years had passed since Alexander Sterling and Madison Clarke had left the city behind, trading the steel skyline of Chicago for the gentle rise and fall of the waves along Cape Cod. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of salt and seaweed, and sunlight glittered across the water in scattered diamonds. Alexander stood barefoot on the porch of their modest, sunlit home, coffee cup in hand, eyes tracing the horizon where the sky kissed the Atlantic. Madison was nearby, notebook resting on the railing, pen in hand, but today it was different. Today they weren't preparing reports or analyzing strategy. They were simply present, together, immersed in a life they had consciously chosen. The last 2 years had been a rhythm of learning, of building, of discovering the edges of possibility in a quieter, slower world. They had founded a consulting firm focused on authentic leadership, taking the lessons of their Chicago campaigns and adapting them to companies across the United States, eventually reaching international clients. Their strategy, rooted in transparency, integrity, and genuine connection, had become a quiet revolution. Businesses that implemented their guidance reported not just improved profits but stronger employee loyalty, healthier workplace culture, and a renewed sense of purpose. Alexander often thought about the contrast: a world once dominated by power games now shifting because a few people chose honesty over manipulation. Madison, seated on the porch steps, looked up from her notes, eyes reflecting sunlight and calm. "We've come a long way," she said softly, almost to herself. Alexander glanced down at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "We have," he agreed, voice low, warm. He set the coffee on the railing and lowered himself beside her, feeling the rhythm of the waves below, feeling the quiet pulse of a life unhurried, deliberate, and shared. They spent mornings walking the shoreline, bare feet sinking into the damp sand, conversations meandering between business ideas and memories of the challenges they had faced. There were moments when Alexander would pause, gaze out at the horizon, and feel a sense of wonder that had been absent during his decades of relentless ambition. Here, there was no boardroom tension, no whispers of internal threat, no pressure to perform. There was clarity, there was space, there was trust, and love. "Do you ever miss it?" Madison asked one late afternoon. Voice soft, almost lost in the wind. Alexander thought for a moment, considering the life he had left behind. "Sometimes," he said honestly, "but the cost wasn't worth it before. Here, it is." He gestured toward the waves, the home, the life they were building. "Here, we measure success differently. By balance, by presence, by integrity." Madison nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And we still make an impact," she said, eyes sparkling. "People are listening, companies are changing. It's different, but it matters. Alexander reached for her hand, fingers interlacing with hers, grounding them both in the quiet gravity of the moment. There was no rush, no pressure, only the awareness that they had arrived at something both profound and fragile, life shaped by choice, trust, and shared vision. The firm's reputation had grown steadily. Executives called not just to implement methods, but to understand the philosophy behind them. Alexander often found himself on calls, leading discussions with clarity and insight, while Madison guided teams through workshops on empathy, decision-making, and authentic leadership. Their voices carried authority, yes, but it was tempered by patience and humanity, a sharp contrast to the relentless ambition that had defined Alexander's early career. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the water, painting the sky in hues of rose and amber, Alexander and Madison returned from a walk, their feet wet and sand clinging to their toes. They settled on the porch swing, quiet now, letting the day fade into the rhythmic lull of the waves. Alexander inhaled deeply, the brine in the air mingling with a faint warmth in his chest. He felt the weight of past ambition, past loss, and past fear dissolve into the simplicity of presence. 2 years, Madison whispered, voice almost carried away by the wind. 2 years since we took the leap. Alexander nodded, gaze fixed on the horizon. And it's the first time in my life that I feel whole. He turned to her, eyes soft, vulnerable. Because of you. Because of us. Madison reached over, brushing her hand across his cheek, a gentle acknowledgement of the journey they had shared. It was a small gesture, yet laden with meaning, trust, acceptance, love, and the courage to embrace vulnerability. Alexander closed his eyes briefly, leaning into the touch, letting it anchor him in the present. The night deepened, stars reflecting in the gentle undulations of the water. They sat together, side by side, breathing in the rhythm of waves, the whisper of wind, the quiet pulse of a life intentionally shaped. No words were needed for understanding. Their shared history, the victories, the trials, the moments of doubt, all merged into this single, expansive presence. Alexander reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, smooth shell he had picked up during their walk. He handed it to Madison, a simple token, no grandeur, no expectation, just a symbol of their journey, of choosing connection over control, love over ambition, and life over empire. Madison accepted it, her fingers brushing his, eyes meeting his with quiet warmth. They let the moment linger, suspended in time, the ocean breathing alongside them. There was forgiveness in the distance from past mistakes, release in the choice to prioritize love, and an awareness that success had taken on a new definition, one that encompassed joy, balance, and integrity. As the first waves of dawn hinted over the horizon the following morning, Alexander and Madison stepped onto the sand together. He bent, letting the water lap at his feet, then turned to her. She smiled softly, mirroring the light in his chest. "Shall we begin the day?" she asked. Alexander nodded, fingers intertwining with hers. "Yes, let's keep building. Together." And so they did. Together, navigating life and work, shaping influence with integrity, touching others through leadership grounded in authenticity. They had proven something rare, that love and career could coexist without compromise, that ambition could be tempered by humanity, and that happiness could be built on choices, presence, and connection rather than power alone. The waves continued their quiet rhythm, brushing the shore, carrying the scent of salt and freedom. Alexander inhaled deeply, eyes on the horizon, hand resting lightly over Madison's. She leaned against him, small and steady, and together they let the world drift by in gentle motion. A single gull cried in the distance, the wind whispered through the dune grass, and for the first time in decades, Alexander Sterling allowed himself to fully exhale. The past had shaped him, the lessons had guided him, but the present and the life they had chosen was theirs alone. He glanced at Madison, faint smile tugging at his lips. She returned it, quiet, luminous, complete. And as the sun rose fully, spilling gold across the Atlantic, Alexander felt it in the simplest, quietest way. The journey had ended not with power, but with presence, not with control, but with love. And in that gentle, luminous morning, they began anew. Through the journey of Alexander Sterling and Madison Clarke, the story reminds us that true success is not measured solely by wealth, power, or status, but by integrity, respect, and the quality of human connection. Alexander's life illustrates how relentless pursuit of control and influence can create walls around the heart, leaving even remarkable accomplishments feeling hollow. Madison's presence shows that honesty, professionalism, and authenticity have the power to shift perspectives, build trust, and transform not only work, but also personal growth. The story teaches that vulnerability is not weakness. It can be the gateway to deeper understanding, meaningful relationships, and lasting fulfillment. Even in positions of authority, choosing empathy over manipulation and collaboration over self-interest can yield remarkable results. Love, when approached with respect and patience, can coexist with ambition, providing balance and joy that achievement alone cannot offer. For anyone navigating career, relationships, or life transitions, this narrative encourages reflection. Success is most rewarding when it aligns with values, when choices are guided by principle, and when connection and compassion are embraced. It reminds us that it's never too late to redefine priorities, to let integrity guide actions, and to create a life that nurtures both purpose and heart. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey today. If this story touched your heart or gave you something to reflect on, please give us a like, share it with someone who might enjoy it, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Your support means the world, and we can't wait to share the next story with you.